to our final in this series on exploring the Gospel of John. We're going to come to the end of chapter 21. And as we look at the end of chapter 21, it's an important chapter to understand, as I mentioned last week, that up to we get to the point of about the end of chapter 20, it's really telling us about Jesus, about what Jesus did. And then there's almost a sense of the handing over in 21, where Jesus hands over the mantle of leadership, where Jesus hands over the mission that he had been sent to the world for. He hands that over now to the disciples in the miraculous catch of fish. But what he also foreshadows in this section, the second half of chapter 21, is that not everything is going to go perfectly. Not everything is always going to work well within the life of the church or the life of what happens later on. And so, in a sense, he gives a little bit of input into that before he will then give his major input, which, of course, is the book of Revelation itself. So let's listen again to this beginning part, this first section, or at least this last section of the book of John. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw that a disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. It's an interesting end to the gospel. It's an end to the gospel where you've got the story of Jesus being asking Peter about whether he loves him. We then have Peter looking back over his shoulder and seeing most probably John and ask him what's going to happen to him. And then Jesus gives it's a little strange reply. And then we've got the last part where we're told that if everything that Jesus said was written down, would there be enough books in the world to contain it? And so there's lots of interesting stuff there. But I want to again reiterate with you that I believe that this last section is really John's bridge between his gospel, which was about Jesus, and then his book about the church, which is the book of Revelation. This is the bridge between those two sections. It's the handing on of the story, as we saw in the miraculous catch of fish, where we are now partners with Christ in his mission to become fishers of men, as we see in the Gospel of Luke. But this next section gives us a bit of a warning in terms of how that process will work and some of the attributes that this new church needs to have. So what I'd like you to do to begin with is to just listen again to that section and to ask yourself, what is it about it that strikes you as interesting? What strikes you as being odd? What can you learn or connect with from it? Let's spend some time reflecting on that. Welcome back. As we reflect on the context of these 10 verses, we want to start with some of the contextual things, some of the things that link this passage to the passages that have been before. And you'll see that there's one link, for example, where Jesus, where Jesus and Peter are obviously talking a little distance from the disciples, and they've started walking, and now John follows them, and he looks back over his shoulder. And of course, in our English Bibles, we get in the parentheses where it talks about the fact that the person following was the one who asked at the supper, who's going to betray you? And so that kind of links these verses back into the rest of the gospel. And if you go back to that chapter in the upper room, you'll see that that's really what that was about as well. But the interesting thing for me is not so much about John, but much more about Peter. And there's two things that connect this passage for me in terms of Peter and Peter's life. The first one, of course, is that it reminds us again of Peter's denial of Jesus. In fact, as I've been saying in this Bible study, that in fact it's Peter's betrayal of Jesus. That remember, 3 times he was asked, "Do you know him?" And Peter's response was, "No, I don't. I don't know him." And it's interesting that when you see that concept of not knowing Jesus, that by the time we get to this section now, Peter's response instead is, "I love you. You know that I love you." And then even for him to get hurt by saying, "Of course, why are you asking me a 3rd time? Of course I love you." And it's interesting that there's this balancing act that happens here between the betrayal of Peter and then this reinstatement, almost as if each of those sins need to be dealt with individually. That in each time Jesus says, "Do you love me?" "Yes, I do." "Do you love me?" "Yes, I do." "Do you love me?" "Yes, I do." Which in a sense wipes out the "Do you know him?" "No, I don't." "Do you love him?" Or "Do you know him?" "No, I don't." "Do you know him?" "No, I don't." For me, that's a wonderful balance that happens here. But I don't think it's only for Peter's benefit. I think it's for our benefit. You see, I think that in fact, as the church, so often we also betray Jesus. So often we also deny Jesus. And so often people will say, "Do you know Christ?" And we will say either by our words or our actions, "No, I don't know him." But isn't it wonderful that even after we've denied Christ, even after we've betrayed him by our word or our action, that we can meet him again at the side of the lake and he can ask us, "Do you love me?" Notice that Jesus doesn't say, "I forgive you," or, "I felt very bad," or, you betrayed me." He doesn't focus on the betrayal. Instead, he refocuses on the reinstatement. He focuses on the reconnection. He focuses on that which would actually reconnect Peter again to the mission that he's given him. And I think that's the same thing that Christ does for us. I think the church has been so filled with the realities of trying to tell people you've sinned and you need to ask for forgiveness for your sin. When in fact, maybe the focus should have been instead, "Do you love me?" Because, just because we love somebody doesn't mean we're not going to, on occasion, betray them, both in word or in action. That just because, in fact, we are saying that we're Christians doesn't always mean that we live that way. But it's in the midst of that Jesus comes to us again and says, "Do you love me? Because if you love me, then I will reinstate you." And isn't the best part of forgiveness not to have our sins forgiven, but in fact to have our mission restored, to have our identity restored? to have who we are in the sight of God restored. Isn't that what forgiveness truly is? That forgiveness isn't about the sin. Forgiveness is about the life-giving that forgiveness brings us. That in forgiveness we can have our faith, our life, our connection, our hope restored in Christ. That's what forgiveness is about. Forgiveness isn't about the sin. Forgiveness is about the reinstatement to the mission that Christ has given us. We're going to talk more about the mission later on. But I think that that context is so important for us as the church. Because if you look back over the history of the last 2,000 years of the church, how many times have the church been involved in betraying and in denying Christ's name? Sometimes even while we acknowledge his name, we betray it. We burnt people at the stake. Where in the Bible did it tell us that we should do that? When we went to war with a cross in front. Where in the New Testament does it tell us to do that? There's so many times when we've betrayed Christ. But Christ doesn't say, that's it. I'm not working with you anymore. Instead, he says, in all that you've done, do you love me? And we can respond with, yes, Lord. You know that we do. Yet we are broken. Yet we do fail. And yet we will continue to follow you. Reinstate us to our mission. Reinstate us to our identity. Reinstate us to the connections in God. Let's discuss that. Welcome back. We're going to look at two different things now, which I think that connect us a little deeper into this passage. And the first one that I want to look at is that concept of what happens between Peter and John. And essentially where Peter looks back and he says, well, what about him? It's a very natural thing, isn't it? Where in fact, instead of looking at Jesus, we're looking at each other. And I think that's part of the image that's here, is that it tells us that in fact, one day, Peter's going to be led to where he doesn't want to go. And John explicitly tells us that that will show you the kind of death that he's going to live. Now, some of you may know that in the history of the church, in the legends that go around the disciples, that the legend is that Peter was crucified, and he was crucified in Rome. And not only was he crucified in Rome, but that he was crucified upside down. And so you might remember that, in fact, St. Peter's cross is the cross where the crossbar is at the bottom rather than at the top, as it is in the usual kind of image that we have of the cross. But isn't it interesting that, in fact, this passage tells us, don't worry about him and what's going to happen to him, but there will come a time when you will be led where you don't want to go. I love this passage because of that sense of the humanity of Peter, where Peter goes, well, you've told me what's going to happen to me, but what's going to happen to him? Is he going to go the same way? And Jesus says, well, what happens to him is not up to me or to you. What will happen to him is in the wisdom of God. And of course, then it tells us about the rumor that then came around John that he wouldn't die before Jesus returned. Now, I think that it's a strange passage in some ways. It's a difficult passage. But I think that it's connected again to the concept of the church. Is that I think again in the concept of the church is that too often what we're worried about is each other. What's he going to do? What's his job? What's her connection? What is she doing? What's going to happen to her? Is she going to do this? Or are we going to do it together? And what essentially Jesus is saying is, stop worrying about what's going to happen to other people. and think about what God's mission has given to you. That what God's given to somebody else, that what their mission is, that what their purpose is, that in fact how long they're even going to live. Don't worry about that. Stop worrying and thinking about what other people are doing, and keep your eyes focused on what God's mission has been given to you. If they're going to live to a ripe old age to do the ministry of God, or if they're not, what difference does that make to you in terms of your mission? You see, I think that so often what we've done is we actually think more about the earthly realities of it. What success looks like for each other. When in fact success for God and for Jesus means faithfulness in him. Are we faithful to the things that God calls us to do? I think it's more our faithfulness that God will question than our comparison with somebody else. Secondly, is that last section where it says there's not enough books in all the world to be able to encompass what Jesus is saying. Now, in some ways you could think of that backwards. And that John is actually saying that Jesus has been with us for however long. Now, sometimes we think it's maybe 3 years, 3.5 years. The truth of it is that it could have been a much longer than that. In fact, it could have been 7 or 8 years, depending on how you organize the time. I don't think it matters, because I don't think that line actually refers to the past. I think that line in some ways refers to the future. Now, if you think about it, how many books about Christ have been written over the last 2,000 years? I think it's an amazing concept. Because in some ways, that's closer to the truth. Is that in fact, how many books are there in the world that have been written about Jesus? That in fact, Jesus will still speak to his church. That Jesus will still come and encourage his church in connecting with that. You see, when I think that there's not enough books in the world, it's not so much to encapsulate what Jesus was saying to the disciples, as much as Jesus will continue to speak to his disciples throughout the future. Till one day there's a culmination of history, Jesus will actually encapsulate all of that. That Jesus is still speaking to us. That Jesus is still encouraging us. That Jesus is still taking the words that we have within the New Testament and making it applicable and explaining it and connecting it to this generation and in every generation prior to this one. That there aren't enough books in the world to encapsulate Jesus' words, because in fact he hasn't stopped speaking. He continues to speak to the church. And if we, through the discernment of the Holy Spirit, listen carefully, we can continue to hear what he would have to say to the church today. And in hearing, how much better would it be then to live out what Christ is telling us and sharing with us and encouraging us to do? So I'd like you to think about those two things. On the first hand is to think about the concept of how do we focus on what God's mission is for us, rather than compare that mission to someone else? And how do we understand his continuing speaking into the church today? Let's discuss that. Welcome back. We're going to talk about an application now. And usually this is the last section in each video, but in fact, in this time, it's the second last, because I want to finish this Bible study with a conclusion and to kind of sum up some of what we're doing. But in an application, you can't go past what Jesus tells Peter. 3 times Peter is asked, "Do you love me?" And each time Jesus responds with, "Feed my sheep, feed my lambs, take care of my sheep." Now, the question we've got is it just meaning the same thing? Is he just saying the same thing over and over again? And to some degree, I think, yes. I think that, in fact, what he's using is something that we use often when we preach, often when we teach, often when we just even trying to get our children or even our pets, for that matter, to try and do something, is we use repetition. Repetition. And that Jesus 3 times responds with, "This is the mission I'm giving you." And essentially, if we're going to wrap up, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, essentially what we're going to do is to say that our work is to care for those we have been entrusted to. Now, when Jesus talks about his sheep, he's not just talking about Christians. He's talking about humanity. And essentially what this passage does is it gives us our walking papers. It gives us our connection, saying, come on. This is what we're called to do. This is where we're called to be. We're called to be those who would take care of others. We're called to be those who would actually help those who are hurting to hurt less. Whether that means to feed them, whether it means to clothe them, whether it means to be a companion to them, whether it means to speak good news into their lives, whether it means to actually help those who are poor, that whatever way that we can do that, to actually care for others, is what we need to be doing. There's a little saying that in the previous Dalai Lama, that one day he was asked by a wise man who came to him and said, "What is the meaning of life?" The Dalai thought for a while, and he responded with said, "The meaning of life comes in helping others." And then he said, "And if you can't help them, at least don't hurt them." And I think that that's a wonderful response in terms of what Jesus says. Take care of my sheep. Take care of my lambs. Feed my sheep. You see, I think that in many ways what Jesus is doing there is essentially telling us what the core of all mission is. The core of all mission is not to convert the world. The core of mission is not to fill our churches with worshippers. The core of our mission is not to go out into the world and make members of our church. The core of our mission is to care for all of humanity. And of course, by extension, all of this world in which humanity lives. For if we destroy the world, how does that not hurt the humans who live within it? When I look at this passage, it wants to give us our walking papers. Let's discuss that. How do we spend time? How do we actively take care of and feed the humanity around us? Welcome back one last time. This is the conclusion to this whole Bible study. And we've traveled through the various parts of John's Gospel. And I'm hoping that as we've done that over the time, that you can see some of the themes that have gone through. Some of the themes of sevens, the 7 I ams, the 7 miraculous signs. As we've gone through John's particular way of seeing Jesus, of acknowledging who Jesus is as the one who was there from the beginning. He wasn't just a good guy. He wasn't just a human being that was chosen by God to be in this position. He is the one who was there in the beginning. He is the answer from God for us to find our way into relationship again with God. He is the one who has come so that we might have life, and life in all its fullness. He is the one who has handed on to us the job of going into the world and to care for it as he and his Father care for us. And he is the one who has given us the Holy Spirit to enable us to go and to do that. As we conclude this time together, I want us also to look forward and maybe even encourage you to read that one book of the New Testament, which actually tells us intentionally that if we read it, we will be blessed. And of course, that book is John's second volume. That just as the Gospel of Luke has the second volume in the book of Acts, so John's Gospel has a second volume in the book of Revelation. And that even though for many of us the book of Revelation is hard to read, and it seems to be so fanciful and so strange to read, I want to encourage you to read it. Not to read it as somehow an anticipation of the end of the world, but instead to read it the way in which I believe it was written, which was in fact to help us to be church today, in whichever day that might be. But as you read it with the anticipation of how is Christ wanting to teach us? How is Christ wanting to encourage us? How is Christ wanting to inspire us to actually go into the world and to go and to share the message of Jesus Christ, the Lamb who has been slain? Finally, in our last time to speak together on this topic, I pray that you may spend a bit of time reflecting on John's Gospel as a whole. What parts have stood out for you? What parts will you hold dear? What parts have been relevant and connected to you as you go on your way? Let's discuss that together.